And you were only 2 years old, and feeble was your frame. I could not leave you with my friends, for you bore your father's name. I wrapped you in my coat of moor at the dead of night unseen. I heaved a sigh, bade goodbye to dear old Skibbereen. Hi, Dermot Power here again with another little slice of Waterford and indeed Irish history. Now, today's episode is about a very little known part of Irish and Waterford history. And the reason being is that it was forgotten about very, very quickly. And it really centres around the 1830s, 1840s, and indeed into the 1860s. But it just fell out of, I won't say fashion, but it wasn't something that people were particularly interested. Now, where did I get my information from then? Well, I got my information from parliamentary reports and journals at the period, and in particular the newspapers. Now, I have all the newspapers online from Irish Newspaper Archive, absolutely brilliant resource, very, very reasonable to get it for the year. And you have all the Irish newspapers, indeed, from all over the place, and it's absolutely brilliant source. So, what is today's episode? Well, it's about probably the most vulnerable section of our society during the famine period, and that was the orphans in the workhouses. Now, from the 1830s, Irish people were being sent to Australia because Australia was a relatively new country, and they were sending people over them, both men and women. And then after that, in the 1840s, there was what was called the bounty system. Now, what was called the bounty system was that people would come to Ireland and they would try and get people to go to Australia. And if they got successful in getting people to go, they would get a fee for getting them to go. But then in the late 1840s, at the height of the famine, it was very quickly discovered that there was an awful lot of women in workhouses, and they were seen as unproductive. And so there and then lay the problem, because the upkeep of those were on the rates. So that means all the businesses in Waterford and the relatively wealthy people had to pay a rate, and that went for the upkeep of those. So it was found to be cheaper to send the people to places like Australia. So between 1849 and 1851, 4,175 young orphans were sent from Ireland to Australia. But it didn't end there, because I'll give you an example. The Earl Grey system is what the scheme was known as, and Waterford City and the South East Ireland sent their share of orphan girls. And it says on the Waterford News in April 1849, it reported that 25 pauper girls left the city on Tuesday for Australia. They were most tastefully and respectfully dressed. Now, the same newspaper reported that 18 pauper girls left the Callum Workhouse for Dublin, there to embark for Australia. In September of the same year, it was reported that this morning 23 orphan girls left this city, that's Waterford City, by B&. Coney's car en route for Dublin, from whence they will sail on tomorrow for Plymouth, and then where the Panama, that's the name of the ship, awaits them to take them to the destination, and the destination was Australia. The newspaper also reported that the guardians of the New Ross Union also prepared 18 girls for the same destination. They will depart tomorrow. Now, some modern historians have stated that no girl was forced to emigrate, and indeed many girls did agree to go or even ask to go. However, again, this is where the parliamentary reports come in and essentially contradicts that belief. In the proceedings of the Parliament of South Australia is the following comment, and it says, I observe that when I enclosed a nominal list of 564 Irish female immigrants, of whom only 286, or a little more than half, asserted they had applied to be sent there. Now, it seems that a lot of girls were more or less duped into going, and indeed you will see in the newspapers a lot of letters from girls from us purporting to come from Australia, who said they were having a great time there and they were so thankful that they were sent. But the fly in the ointment, so to speak, is these letters
all you have to do is look at them. They were professionally written. They were written by a professional, certainly not by an illiterate girl from the workhouse. Now, these orphans were sent out mainly as domestic servants at a much lower rate of wages than were ordinarily paid to servants in Australia. That was part of the deal. Now, the Roman Catholicism also proved to be a stumbling block, and some employers who referred to them as dirty Irish and ignorant papists. A similar bias was actually shown towards Irish men in New South Wales who came particularly from the south of Ireland and were classified as, and again I quote from the newspaper, in point of intellect inferior to our own Aborigines. While it is probably true that the young girls were not trained to do the type of work that they were expected to do, it seems that the expectations of the employers may have been too high and were not prepared to either encourage or train the young girls that were given to them as servants. In the inquiry relating to the Irish orphan girls in 1859, one sympathetic employer, when asked, "Who do you think is to blame for the way the girls behaved or couldn't do their work?" And he more or less said, look, if they had been treated good and had been shown how to do the work, they would have been as good as any. But it didn't happen. So an awful lot of people sent their orphan girls back to the government and said, these girls are no good. Between March 1849 and May 1851, 254 girls were returned by their employers as not being competent. Some of the girls brought allegations of assault against their employers, and these girls were turned not to a workhouse or home, but to a jail. Instead of training them for future employment, they put them to picking oakum. Now, what's that? Well, when they made the old sailing ships, and there would be a space between the planks, and they would get twine, or rope I should say, and put it between the spaces, and they would tar over it. Now, as the years went by, these things would become useless, so they take the rope out and they take the tar off to reuse it. So they pick the pieces of tar off, and that's what was called picking oakum. Now, we must remember that these young girls who were sent out from Waterford and from all the workhouses in Ireland were between the ages of 14 and 18 years old. Can you imagine a young little girl of 14 and she picking this tar off of these ropes? The fingers would be cut off them. Now, according to the inquiry, the girls, which amounted to 50 or 60 of them, were confined in a locked room with very little ventilation. The room measured 100 foot long by 20 foot wide. There they slept, ate and drank. Now, there was a similar yard of about the same size where the girls exercised. The average age of the girls was between 16 and 17, and the inquiry stated that the orphan girls had to endure the conditions for a long time. Now, in 1850, this is very interesting, gold was discovered in Australia, and the Australian government asked to send out Irishmen as labourers. And the newspaper commented, however, a barren harvest awaited them, that was the commissioners. The famine and the United States Charter of Citizenship had thinned their ranks, but there were comely lasses galore, fine, healthful, hopeful colleens, graduating in their thousands in the pauper cells that clustered the land from Skull to Stranraer. And in the colony of Victoria alone, the amount of bachelors amounted to the goodly number of 50,000 who only awaited the presence of many blushing, blooming maidens to cut the cords that bind them to domestic misery and forced celibacy. We are not surprised to find them beseeching His Grace and the Honourable Board to provide them wives from among, and listen to this, the blue-eyed workhouse girls of Munster and the raven-haired damsels of fair Connacht. It appears, as suggested in the piece, that the purpose of these young orphans was to be sexual fodder for the women-hungry Australian outbackers. Now, there is another thing that is very disturbing and very alarming, and I find it extremely disturbing because the bonds of marriage were not the only cords that bound the Irish workhouse girls. There was also the cords of prostitution. Now, in a letter dated the 29th of October 1850 and published in a journal, the Fund for Promoting Female Emigration, it lauded the fact that so many English immigrants had found work. However, It shone a light into the dark corners of the fate of many Irish orphans whose profession became that of prostitute. The letter stated, "I am sorry to state it is here, as in other populous towns, a description of persons ready to entrap the unwary, and I am sorry to say that this has been the case with a vast number of Irish orphans who have been sent out here and to pursue a course of life that placed them beyond the pale of society, that is, prostitution." In 1861, an Irish publication expresses in even stronger language the fate of workhouse girls. Can one of us imagine the feelings of an evicted tenant with the prospect of the workhouse before him and his wife and family? If he enters, that is the workhouse, and keep them there, his sons are doomed for the remainder of their lives to be dishonest beggars. His daughters, after living a few years of squalid misery in the poorhouse, will leave the place and become prostitutes. Now, I'm quoting from a newspaper in this. They will lead the lives of prostitutes and die the death of prostitutes. They will drown their wretchedness in drunkenness. They will wake the echoes of our streets with their midnight shrieks of despair. They will die of unnamed diseases, that's venereal diseases, in some splendid hospital. Such has been the fate of almost all the female children reared in Irish poorhouses. Indeed, at a very early stage of the removal of Irish orphans, it was noted in a report from the Melbourne Orphan Board and dated the 26th of October 1849, the following passage, that the orphans by each succeeding ship had been disposed to parties of a lower rank and less desirable class than those preceding. What I meant by that was that it wasn't the wealthy families that were getting the orphans, because, as I said, they were unable to do any form of work whatsoever. They just didn't have the knowledge. They weren't trained in school. They were essentially illiterate. They didn't know how to make a bed. They didn't know how to wash up a cup. They didn't know any domestic duties whatsoever. And they were given then to lower class families. And I am sure, I'm 1000% sure, that they were both abused mentally and physically and probably sexually. It says here, implicit in that statement is the suggestion that the welfare of the Irish orphans was at best precarious and at worst an entry into prostitution. Now, another aspect of this removal of the Irish from Ireland to Australia was the mortality on the ships. I have here a report. It says, the mortality of the Australian emigration ships was described as fearful, and deaths were more common on the larger ships, such as those carrying 500 to 1,000 passengers. Out of one ship, the Condra, which sailed from Liverpool in August 1852 with 800 emigrants, no less than 200 corpses were flung into the sea before she touched the quays of Melbourne. The word dead was written opposite 3,000 names out of the 50,000 who embarked for New South Wales and Victoria in that year before the end of the long voyage. In the returns, the native country of those who died were not given. However, as the newspaper The Nation caustically remarks, we are sure that the Irish, as usual, furnished their full quota of the bills of mortality. The amount of deaths are frightful, consider these figures are only for a very short period. In the publication promoting emigration, none of this is mentioned, and the impression is given that the pats of Australia were littered with gold, but as the Irish emigrants soon found out, all that glitters is not gold. Now, how shall we classify or categorise these young girls and their removal from Ireland? Was it a case of ethnic cleansing? Well, a lot of people believe it was, because in actual fact there was more Irish girls sent to Australia than English or Scottish girls. And much of the historical attention has been focused on the 4,175 orphan girls sent to New South Wales between 1848 and 1851. However, the following figures suggest that the female emigration from Ireland to Australia continued unabated after 1851. Now, we also find that in up to 1863 that girls were sent to Canada. And in 1863, a parliamentary report, it was advocated, it would be, in my humble opinion, this is quoting from the parliamentary report, it would be, in my humble opinion, it would be far better for the imperial government not to allow the masters or matrons of workhouses to send to this country, that's Canada, the poor union workhouse girls of the old country, unless they have been told some of the work necessary to be done in a Canadian house or on a Canadian farmer, which are but little, if at all, inferior to those of Great Britain, whereas they have hitherto annually inundated our labour market with those poor, inexperienced Irish girls who have never been accustomed to a single item of household or farm work. Now, the next letter is fascinating because it comes from an Irishman. His name is T.D. Mee, Terence D'Arcy McGee. He was a young Irelander, a friend of Thomas Marr. And before all the young Irelanders were captured by the English, he escaped and went to Canada, and he became a politician and a minister for immigration. That's people coming into the country. So he wrote a scathing letter to the Irish newspapers regarding the incompetence of the Irish workhouse girls. He wrote, "These unhappy girls are thrown on a strange soil without the commonest industrial training, without being fit for dairy or kitchen, without a knowledge of washing, ironing, plain sewing, or any description of common usefulness by which to make a decent living." He also laments the treatment meted out to the girls in either the workhouse in Ireland or on board a ship while travelling to Canada. He continues, "But far worse remains, either before they have left Ireland or while on shipboard, many of them have been subjected to temptations they were unable to resist. We Irishmen on the colony, that's Canada, proud amongst the few legacies left to us, is the matchless virtue of our countrywomen. We have been obliged to hang our heads in shame and to close our doors in the faces of the lost girls you send us out." Very, very sad. Similarly, a Catholic clergyman writing from Kingston in Canada West wrote, "It would make your blood run cold to see them," that's the workhouse girls, "here from the boat that brings them, thrown on the quay without any protection, to go where they like, sometimes 300 at a time. You would see them going through the streets in flocks of 20 and 30, not knowing where to go. These creatures flock into every poor lodging house, not knowing but it's into a house of ill repute they are trusting themselves." Now, we all know of the families who went out. You have the Kennedys, of course. Then you had some of the great politicians in America, Tip O'Neill, the Dalys from Mayor Daly from Waterford, his family from Waterford and all that. They all made it. I'd love to know what happened. We know a lot of the families survived out there and their children sold. And indeed, in Sydney, in Australia, there is a beautiful monument up to all the workhouse orphans that went out. And that was initiated by the Australians themselves, not by the Irish. But what happened to the women that were prostitutes? Or was it, as that it was suggested, they would die of unnamed diseases in some splendid hospital? However, the pleas of T.D. McGee and others fell on deaf ears, and the removal of the workhouse females continued unabated. In February 1863, the Ennis Workhouse sent 25 young girls to Canada. In March 1863, the Waterford City Workhouse decided to send out 66 girls to Canada. It stated that the emigration committee of the Waterford Workhouse decided to accept the offer of the Anchor Line from Greencock at £5 per head to bring 60 girls from here to Glasgow per the Plata. That's the ship, I presume it was from Waterford that sailed, on the 6th of April at 10 a.m. at 7 and 6 each. It was further ordered that the master take shares of the immigrants from this to Glasgow. The girls selected were described as the greater majority of them reared in the workhouse, some of them as orphans, others the children of the parents who deserted them in childhood. It appears that they had a great affection for the master of the Waterford Workhouse. His name was Thomas Ryan, and I mention him deliberately because I'm not saying that all the masters of the workhouses were bad, but some of them were infamous. And Thomas Ryan, it would appear, showed a great degree of humanity and kindness to the workhouse orphans. And he went on the journey from Waterford to Glasgow, and from Glasgow they were taken in a ship to Canada. And it says here, and when the ship was leaving for Canada, the girls burst into tears as they parted from Mr. Ryan. The removal of both men and women from Ireland as indentured servants can only be viewed, I believe, as ethnic cleansing. Although the number of orphan girls removed from the Waterford workhouse was not large, the intent and desire was to remove all paupers if possible. The following is from the Waterford News of 1850, and it illustrates just that. The piece is entitled Good Move and reads, "The guards of the Dungarvan Union are resolved in sending out 300 pauper girls to Quebec in next June. After some time they propose to send out 300 more. Would it not be well and the saving if all the able-bodied of every union were sent away?" Now, some will argue that it was ethnic cleansing of the Irish, others will disagree. But what was perpetrated on the destitute of Ireland, and indeed England and Scotland, was definitely class cleansing. One contemporary account describes the Irish poor in the early days of the Australian colonies, that they felt themselves condemned to misery in this world and perdition in the next. Dying unhoused, that means not having received the Eucharist or Holy Communion. Disappointed, unannaled, that means unannaled means not having received extreme unction at the point of death. But of course the Irish were always available, whether they agreed to it or not, to provide a platform of experimentation for the English. The following is from the Glasgow Chronicle of 1838, and it proves just that. And it reads, "We understand there is a contemplation to send a few people of both sexes from the Emerald Isle for the purpose of raising a stock of free labourers of Irish extraction born in the West Indian climate and inured to it, and who will be most likely to stand the climate rather than imported whites." What they mean by that is, rather than sending the English out, let's send a couple of paddies out, let them get used to the sun and breed like rabbits out there, and we'll have loads and loads of Irish out there who can stand and bear the scorching sun. The perception of many people is that what it was called, termed the famine, which is a terrible name for it because there was no famine in Ireland at the time. The Irish description of it is on Gortamore, the Great Hunger, because there was enough food in Ireland between 1845 and 1850 to feed a population of 10 to 12 million. But what happened? The landlords, greedy landlords, wanted their cash crop and they wanted their money, and so it was exported from Ireland. Now, if you go on the internet and you look, search famine in Ireland, you will see between 1845, the famine lasted for 6 years. The potato famine killed 1 million men, women and children in Ireland and caused another million to flee the country. However, that is right, but it's misleading. Because if we go to 1841, the census of that year said there was, I think, something like 8.3 million people in Ireland. Jump forward 50 years to 1891, and another census was taken in 1891, and we have only 4 million left. That's north and south of Ireland. And half of our population were gone in 50 years. Half. An incredible figure. Down to 4 million from over 8 million. So, the following description of Ireland in 1867 demonstrates the effects of the famine was far from over. An extract from the London Review, reprinted in the Waterford News, states that the true land of Ireland is dead. Observant men who have visited Ireland in the latter days have seen with grief and amazement the thick clouds that have settled over the land. The Irish peasant of 50 years ago, the Irish peasant whom Samuel Lover, he was a writer, loved to paint, is a thing of the past. The matchmaker, the kosher, the old village piper is a broken-hearted pauper in the nearest workhouse. The head school is broken up. The old teacher lies in some forgotten and uncared for grave. Some of his little scholars are stout shepherds in the Australian bush. Others have found their resting place in the battleground of Virginia. Now, that's a reference to the American Civil War, where the Irish fought on both sides. And a very interesting thing is that during the Civil War, the American government sent over, that's the Union government, our federal government as they were known, sent over people to Ireland to try and recruit Irishmen to join up the Union. I've never seen a reference to that. I came across that reference in a newspaper, but I had never seen it apart from that one reference in a newspaper. Now, the newspaper commented, as far as the rural population was concerned, Irish nationality was dead. An ignominious death in Widow McCormick's cabbage patch garden. That's a reference to the 1848 rebellion, the Young Ireland Rebellion. There was an action which took place up in Tipperary, and it was very, very short-lived. Now, the sad, sad tale of the forgotten Irish orphans was until recently forgotten, as I said. I think we should commemorate them here in Waterford with a statue, or at least a plaque, to tell the world and to tell Waterford people, we've not forgotten you. You who were so cruelly torn from the bosom of your beloved country. And whilst we are delighted for the people who emigrated and got on and had a good life, and also are still very proud of their Irish ancestry, yet there are those, and I'll say it one more time, those who died of unnamed diseases in some splendid hospitals. So until the next time for another episode, it's goodbye from me, Dermot Power.
Oh, Father dear, the day will come when vengeance loud will call, when Irishmen with feeling stern will rally one and all. I'll be the man who'll lead a van beneath a flag of green, when loud and high I'll raise a cry, revenge for Skibbereen.